Hello, my name is Gustavo Hinojosa, Executive Director for the National Cybersecurity Student Association. I would like to welcome everyone to our monthly webinar series. Our presentation today will be on the 3 Faces of Insider Threats by Willis-Ford, Senior Principal at CSRA. Many information security groups categorize insider threats as either malicious or unintentional. Research shows that there's a significant number of insider security policy violations that are non-malicious but intentional. These are employees that view security policies as an obstruction to get work done or as an inconvenience. Non-malicious security violations can directly cause breaches or indirectly assist either malicious insiders or external attackers. This presentation, we will discuss all 3 aspects of insider threats and offer research-based approaches to manage the threat. At this time, I will turn it over to Mr. Ford.
Thank you, Gus, thanks for giving me the opportunity to speak. The 3 Faces of Insider Threat. My name is Willis-Ford, and I work at a company called CSRA. One of the cool things about being a speaker is you get to talk about yourself. So just quick on this slide, I am ex-Navy. I was a nuclear reactor operator in fast attack submarines, which was a pretty cool job, but was a long time ago. More recently, I am in a doctorate in information assurance program. Hopefully, defending my dissertation next year will be done by this time next year. I'm also part of the technical working group or the board of the NIST-based Federal Information Systems Security Educators Association. I'm an industry board member on this group, the NCSA, and I'm also on the working group for the National Initiative for Cybersecurity Education. So really involved in cybersecurity workforce development, and my research focus tends to be on the human side of cybersecurity, policy, training, governance, compliance, things like that. So here's what we're going to talk about today. First, a high-level view of the different categories of insider threat. Then we're going to go through each one of them, but the focus is going to be on the non-malicious insiders, because that's the one that tends not to get enough attention. So a high-level view of the categories of insider threat. U.S. CERT, which is based at Carnegie Mellon University, kind of sets the standard for a lot of the government's research and policy on insider threat. And they have 2 categories. One's malicious, which is the theft of intellectual property, IT sabotage, fraud, espionage, whether it's industrial espionage or state espionage, and then the accidental or unintentional, which is basically human error. Other researchers, and Guo et al. In 2011, published the first paper that I've seen that really addresses this category, and that's non-malicious. And the authors of that paper define non-malicious as, first of all, and the most important aspect is it is intentional. It is not an accidental violation. They know they're violating policy. And it's self-benefiting without malicious intent. So they're wanting to help themselves, whether it's making their job easier, or in some cases just enabling them to get their job done. And we'll talk about how we can fix that problem with better policy. And voluntary rule breaking. Nobody's twisting their arm. They're choosing to violate policy. And then the last one, obviously, possibly causing damage or a higher security risk. So let's talk a little bit about insider threat overall. This is from Dark Reading, which if you're not poking at that site periodically, that's a great place to get news and information about the cybersecurity world. But they did a survey on insider threat, and these responses are from security folks. 60% felt that the 3 largest risk groups, 60% said it was privileged IT users and admins. 57% said it was contractors or consultants or temporary workers, but over half said regular employees. And so we're going to talk about the malicious insider threat, and here's some headline examples of malicious insiders. Scrappy Games, they admit that, Kixeye, which was the Scrappy game startup, Kixeye admits that they have one of their employees copied intellectual property from Zynga and brought them over when they hired him. A big data leak that the Swiss spy agency noticed. There's a network admin in San Francisco that kidnapped his employee's network to get revenge. Again, sabotaging ex-employer's system, records stolen from Fidelity. The Flowers Hospital employee stole patient information to sell it. These are all headlines you can find pretty much every week. So that's the malicious insider. And US CERT looked at over 800 malicious insider attacks. And their conclusion, while not directly helpful, it does kind of open our minds to what we're looking for. There's no standard profile of a malicious insider. You can't look at, you can't have a town hall and look at your 500 employees and pick the ones out that are going to be malicious insiders. There's no demographic pattern to follow. Some of the things you can look for is what they call feedback loops. And here again, because I tend to lean towards the human side of cybersecurity, unhappy employees, which leads to poor performance, which leads to unhappier employees, which leads to some kind of get better plan or discipline, and then makes them even more unhappy. And then that gets into the disciplinary action, which leads to an unhappier employee. So the motive, by far, is usually either personal gain or revenge against the employer. And going to one of our favorite malicious insiders, no matter what you think, whether he was right or wrong in doing it, his actions define a malicious insider. He took his consulting job with the intent to steal data, and passed all his interviews, passed his security clearance. Nobody could have predicted, based on what they saw of him, that he was going to take that action. So US CERT also says that most malicious insiders exploit vulnerabilities in business process as often as they exploit technical vulnerabilities. And you'll hear this, in my blog postings and a lot of things that I talk about in groups, is technical controls are great, but they only solve part of the problem, or they only manage part of the problem. Nothing solves it completely, but they only manage part of the problem. You have to look at other aspects. Equally as often as technical vulnerabilities are business process vulnerabilities. So malicious insider success relies heavily upon weak policy, poorly followed process, and lack of training of other employees. So, and these are things that are directly in our control. And then the last is a quote from a CERT report. It was through additional aggravating variables originating with IT personnel's and management's actions or inactions that data breach incidents occurred. So again, the human factor. Here's a report from Gartner that talks about the breakdown of malicious insiders. Why are they doing what they're doing? So 62% are what they call a second streamer, and what that means is a second income stream. They're looking to sell the data. The saboteurs are the people that are looking for revenge against their employer, whether it's backdooring servers and injecting malware, or whatever it is. They're looking to get revenge. And then career launcher is an interesting thing too, because those are the guys that are stealing intellectual property, going over to another company, and if that new company isn't ethical enough, they feel that stolen intellectual property will help them get a job there. So what can we do about the malicious insider? Again, I'm focusing on the non-technical controls. Emphasize policy and security awareness training. And I talk about this later, but there's a big hint here that once a year PowerPoint deck for awareness training isn't enough. There are technical tools out there, and there are more popping up all the time. And I'm not endorsing a particular tool, but I recently spoke with representatives from a company called Red Owl, and that is one example of a behavioral analysis tool that looks at things. It establishes a baseline of the behavior of your employees on the network, and then can detect when behaviors go outside the norm. and help you track, like, oh, this employee's, logging in at 3 in the morning, or this employee is suddenly sending a large chunk of data outside the network, and other behavioral things like that. The catch with that is that they're reactive, right? It will warn you after the fact, essentially, like, hey, this employee is, exhibiting erratic behavior or exhibiting unusual behavior. Then you go find out, what was going on, and it turns out that the data has already been exfiltrated. So another thing is help your employee base become part of your security program. And I don't think near enough companies do this. Educate your employees on the signs of possible malicious insiders. If they hear a coworker threatening the organization or bragging about what they could do, if they ever, really tick me off, I can do this to them, right? Well, if you report that as an employee, it doesn't mean that you're getting them in trouble. It means you're helping protect your company. And we have to establish that mindset. Downloading large amounts of data after they resign but before they leave. It astounds me how often I hear this happening. Someone resigns or submits their resignation, so in 2 weeks I'm out of here, and then they start downloading their, in my industry, which is, federal systems integrator, a lot of the people that work in my job as solution architects have huge libraries of previous proposals. And, if a solution architect submits their resignation and in that 2 weeks starts downloading a lot of data on proposal information, well, that's very business sensitive information, and that should raise suspicions. At work during odd hours compared to their usual schedule. Attempted social engineering, and I'll get into this a little bit later, not just from external sources, right? I mean, I'm ex-Navy. In the Navy, we went to all kinds of training about what to do if someone was asking us for a telephone book from the Navy base, because that's how they kind of groom you, how they start with a social engineering attempt to get you to work your way up into really classified material. But it's not just outsiders, as I'll talk in a minute. Social engineering can happen with insiders also. So it's important for employees to understand policy so that they know when someone is trying to convince them to violate policy. If they're not familiar with their policy, they won't know that people are trying to convince them to violate it. And lastly, employees need to know, and it has to be easy for them to report their concerns. They have to understand that, it's not going to make a mountain fall on the employee they're reporting, but it's just going to make the company be more aware of what's going on and take a look to make sure things are okay. And the last thing, as many people reported, Snowden used social engineering on his coworkers to gain access to larger amounts of data. He only had access to a small amount, direct access to a small amount of the data he released. He talked his coworkers into helping him by saying, hey, they've given me this task. I don't have the access I need and able to do it. Can you help? And some of the employees allowed him to be on their laptops while they were logged in, or they logged in to their accounts on his laptop, which gave him access to a much larger amount of data. So here's, I have permission from the author to use this in my presentations, but in this corner we have firewalls, encryption, antivirus software, etc. And in this corner we have Dave. And apologies if anyone in the audience are named Dave, not targeting you, but this is all about human error. So you can see we're about to talk about the accidental insider. So going back to CERT, their definition of the unintentional insider threat is, current or former employee, contractor, business partner has access to systems through action or inaction without malicious intent. And this is where where CERT muddies the water between accidental and non-malicious, causes harm or substantially increases the probability of future serious harm, basically raising risk. And their major characteristic is a failure in human performance. So, accidental insider examples, accidental disclosure, right? Posting sensitive data on public websites. We see this a lot. Sending sensitive data to the wrong email address. You're in Outlook, you start typing the address, you hit return, and it autofills, you hit return, and guess what? It autofilled the wrong address and you didn't notice. That happens, more often than it should. Malicious code. We just can't get people to stop clicking on links in emails. And if you think about it, industry isn't helping us. I get emails from my bank warning me about phishing emails, and then I get another email from my bank with an embedded link in it. And I'm like, come on, guys, you just told me not to click on links in emails, and you're sending me emails with links. Using found USB drives. Early on in my career working in security, I met a senior Gartner advisor who just said, I can own your network just by scattering a handful of USB drives in your parking lot, because we don't focus on our employees enough, that they understand the risks. They'll pick up the USB drive, go, wonder who dropped this, walk into the building, plug it into their laptop, and boom, they've now opened a hole. Physical data release. For all the idea of us being all online, we're still a heavily paper-based society. And there's a lot of things that get printed out that never get picked up on the printer, or that are in briefcases that get left in airports or in restaurants, or you name it. So physical data release is still a real concern, especially with privacy information and records. Portable equipment, losing a laptop, tablet, losing portable storage devices. There was a Meritalk, M-E-R-I-T-A-L-K survey a few years ago that said one of the biggest threats were that executives didn't like having their laptops encrypted because they thought it slowed them down. So while everybody else in the company had to have their laptops encrypted, they excluded themselves from the requirement. Then when they lose their laptop, they've really lost a lot of very important business sensitive information. So here's a real world example of an accidental insider. A company called Gould Data Systems. The employee was an account manager, and she was in charge of dealing with Medicaid data for the state of Utah. The state health department had requested that she upload a file, but it was too large, right? She couldn't get it to upload properly. It was 6,000 medical records. So full of good intent, she said, well, they're not that far away. I'll just download them to a USB drive and then take the USB drive over there and hand it to them. Well, she lost the USB drive. So here's 6,000 medical records on an unencrypted USB drive, and she loses control of it. Now, near as they can tell, nobody found it and used it for identity theft or anything like that, but that's, near as they can tell. They don't actually know whether or not it's been accessed. The CEO admitted in the after action report, the CEO admitted that the employee probably didn't even know that it was against policy to copy those medical records onto an unencrypted USB drive. So that was an accidental, right? That's an unintentional or accidental insider policy violation. Now, you can go further than that and go, well, why didn't she know that it was against policy? And then that directly takes a look at their awareness program, because those kinds of policies, every employee should be aware of that policy on the So how do we prevent accidental insiders? The U.S. U.S. CERT says training and awareness programs should focus on, and of course it's fancy words, enhancing staff's recognition of the unintentional insider threat problem, and help individuals identify possible cognitive biases and limitations. Basically what they're saying is, train your employees. And so awareness programs, again, do employees even know your policies? And some of those policies were created to help prevent accidental data breaches. Help your employees be aware and understand, know what they're throwing away and where. I've seen companies in my business where people will take their notes from a proposal, a business sensitive where you're trying to win work with the government, and instead of throwing it into the shred bin, they throw it into the regular trash can, which gets emptied every night into the dumpster back of the building. And we all know that dumpster diving occurs, and if I'm from another company, that's a great place for me to find out what your bid strategy is to win that work. Know what notes you're taking in which notebook. Do you have a notebook that you use for your classes or for your outside seminars, and a notebook you use for your internal business sensitive stuff? Know what websites you're visiting. I mean, we have blacklisting in my company, but new websites pop up all the time. Whitelisting can frustrate people to where I know that website's safe, I need to get to it, so let's do a workaround. But if they understand the risk that they're bringing to themselves and to their company, maybe they won't try to get around whitelisting. And know what links you're clicking on. I don't know if you have been to the Homeland Security Stop, Think, Connect program, but it's a program for the public at large to help them get into the habit of thinking about what they're clicking on before they click on it, as one of the approaches to help reduce phishing. So many times it's just as simple as getting them to think about what they're going to do before they do it. There's a lot of parallels with industrial safety programs, and there's some good papers out there that draw those parallels and help walk through ways to reduce the incidence of accidental policy violations by looking at how we reduce the occurrence of industrial accidents in industrial safety programs. And here's one of my favorite cartoons for the non-malicious threat. This guy knows that you're supposed to be aware of shoulder surfing and not working on confidential or business sensitive stuff in the midst of public places. And it's from an ad for a 3M privacy filter. If he had a 3M privacy filter on there, not that I'm endorsing 3M, but that guy would not be able to read his screen. So the non-malicious insider. And this is my favorite topic because, again, it doesn't get the amount of attention it should out in the world. And some people call these guys negligent, but again, that leans toward accidental. And it takes away the feeling of intent. So again, non-malicious insiders are knowingly and intentionally violating policy. So, and that's the differentiator for me as to whether it's accidental or unintentional. They know they're violating policy, so it's done with intent. So Guo et al., 2011, again, they define it as intentional, self-benefiting without malicious intent, voluntary rule breaking, possibly causing damage or security risk. And the most common reasons for these to happen, one, to make the job easier or more convenient, or in some cases even doable, and two, to help a coworker out. Common non-malicious security violations. People don't lock their screens when they walk away from their computer. Now, in companies I've worked with, the screen locks 15 minutes after they quit using it. Great, locks automatically, that's good. But what happens in that 15 minutes? If they're in the habit of walking away from their laptop without locking it, do they do that when they're at Starbucks, right? They have to go to the bathroom. So they get up from their laptop, they're not in the habit of locking it, they go to the bathroom, and so while they're in there, their screen's open, anyone that wants to can pull data or read emails or you name it. They use insecure or personally owned USB storage. They connect business computers to insecure wireless networks. And people will go, well, but they're on VPN, but I know people that will go to Starbucks or to cafes, connect to the non-secured wireless network, and it warns them when they connect to them that it's not secured. But because they're not needing to do email, they don't connect to VPN yet. Or post business-related items on social media. One of my customers, one of my federal customers, was growling about the fact that there was someone that was being promoted to CISO, and before the promotion was announced, I guess that person had told their kids, and their kids posted on Facebook that their mom was going to be the new CISO. So that was a little embarrassing for them. So not a big security violation, just a local embarrassment for that particular agency. More common NMSVs, forwarding work mail to personal email accounts. And I'll get into a great example of where this actually caused harm. Writing down or sharing passwords, that one's been around forever. People still do it. Use personal devices for business without approval. So again, looking at my work, we have BYOD programs. So I can have my personal smartphone on BYOD, which means there's a containerized email and calendar, which is about all I can do with BYOD. But I can get my work emails and I can get my work calendar. I can't copy things from my work email outside that container, right? So that's protected. But what I see people doing in my company and other companies is we'll be in a business strategy session and we've got, network diagrams or system diagrams written all over a whiteboard, and then people will whip out their phone, whether it's on BYOD or not. They'll whip out their phone, take pictures of the whiteboards, and then use their Gmail or Yahoo or MSN email account to send it to themselves in their work account. What they just did was expose business-sensitive material to a non-work network, which is potentially compromised. Another thing, and this does happen in companies with BYOD programs, if I'm in a meeting taking notes on my iPad, nobody looking at me can tell whether that iPad's on the BYOD program or not. I could be taking notes in Evernote and storing it in my personal cloud, right? Which is a risk. Allowing someone to tailgate through a badge door, again, happens all the time. And the company can't post someone at every door in the building, in the multiple buildings, to make sure that nobody's tailgating. Once you're inside the building, using your badge to select someone else's elevator floor without checking to see if they have a badge. So here's one of my two examples of the non-malicious insider. Back to Mr. Snowden. So we know Mr. Snowden's categorized as malicious. He had the intent to collect that data and release it. But he released more data than he had direct access to. Deployed social engineering on his coworkers. So we already talked about that piece of it. But let's look at his coworkers. The coworkers thought they were helping a coworker with a difficult task. They logged in with their accounts on his computer or allowed him to access their computer while they were logged in. They knew they were violating policy. These folks all had fairly high security clearances. They knew that it was inappropriate for them to do that, but they did it anyway. And the reports say that it was 20 or more coworkers that he attempted to deploy this social engineering on. Not sure how many fell for it, but enough fell for it that he got access to a lot of data. And think about if only one of those people had reported it or said something or said, Ed's doing something a little hinky. He tried to get me to do this. Then it could have dramatically reduced the amount of information that leaked or have stopped it completely. Now, again, whether or not you agree with what he was doing when he released the data, this is a good example that can be repeated in many other instances where it's industrial espionage or the people that are trying to steal IP to get a new job. The employees have to be aware of what social engineering looks like and what it could mean if they're violating policy. So my second example, this was in 2013. So the FBI was having a big strategy call with the UK Serious Organized Crime Agency. They wanted to talk about how they were going to deal with Anonymous, the hacktivist group. And within a week or two of having this big strategic conference call, Anonymous posted a complete recording of it. And a lot of people were going, wow, they're really good. How do they know which trunk line to tap? Or, how did they get access to the phone system, et cetera? Well, it wasn't anything like that. One of the Irish Garda officers didn't want to go into his office for the call. So he forwarded the email with the call details, here's the number, here's the call code, to his Gmail account, which someone else had already hacked. He didn't have two-factor authentication. They found it, they saw the email with the call and the subject and sent it to Anonymous. So all Anonymous had to do was dial in, just like everybody else. Again, he knew he was violating policy. He did it for his own convenience, not in an effort to help Anonymous or to hurt, his organization. He just did it because he didn't want to drive into the office. So, another perfect example of a non-malicious insider who actually helped external attackers. So in both cases, the users knew they were violating policy, whether it's the Snowden coworkers, and oh, by the way, they lost their clearances and were fired and will never work in a secure job again. That's the Snowden coworkers. I don't know that anything happened to the Garda police officer. Did they think about the risk to their organization? Probably not. And that's the crux of dealing with non-malicious insiders. So what can we do? Again, and I know I'm kind of beating the horse at this point, but go back to your policies, right? Are your policies easily located by your employees? I've worked for companies that, it was a labyrinth to try to go find the actual policies. Are they easily understandable by non-security folks? I've seen a lot of my customers, they have these marvelous policies, but they're written in such technical jargon that anyone that's not an IT person would never understand what you were talking about. And I think it's a great idea to actually do, user acceptance testing on your policies, right? Have a non-IT or, a non-security person and a non-IT person or groups read through your policies and see if they get it. Ask them, have a meeting, have a discussion, ask them questions about it, see if they actually understand what they're reading. Are employees briefed when policies change? A lot of companies and organizations are guilty of this. They'll make changes to policies and never actually announce them to let employees know, oh, this policy changed. Awareness programs. Here again, as I said before, companies get into the, because again, it's a cost, right? It costs to have an awareness program. Companies get into the habit of having a slide deck that someone puts together based on what other companies are doing or what the industry thinks is important. And once a year, every employee has to flip through the slide deck and sign a thing saying that they went to training. Okay, so that's compliance. And compliance, sadly, is the bane of good policy. Because if all you're shooting for is compliance, that's what you get. You don't get effectiveness. So what the best practices of awareness programs is every company should have custom design training, right? Every company, every organization. Look at what the most often abused policies are. Don't just explain the what. Don't just say this is the policy. Explain why the policy is there and explain how employees can comply, right? A company I worked for said you can't use personal thumb drives or personal USB storage devices. Great. But then they also didn't give you a way to back up your laptop. They didn't supply company-provided USB storage devices. So if people wanted to back up their laptops, their only choice was a personally owned USB storage device. So make sure your policies aren't forcing your employees into a corner where they only have the option of violating the policy. So again, why, how, and what when you're talking to your employees about policy. And going back to the Guo, Yan, Archer, and Connolly, who wrote the paper on non-malicious violations, the things that are key predictors, relative advantage for job performance. Will it help me get my job done faster? Perceived security risk. Does the employee have any idea of what risk they're bringing to the company by violating that policy? Work group norm, right? What do my peers do? And perceived identity match. Does my personal work identity match with the people that I know are violating policy? Those are the key predictors of the intent to do or to perform non-malicious security violations. And again, once a year awareness training isn't enough. I mean, I am a guest presenter regularly for the NASA Security Awareness Program, and they have monthly security awareness sessions where they have internal and external speakers. They're targeted towards topics that they know are important to their employees. And the NASA employees are required, I don't know what the number is, but they have to get a certain number of sessions. They don't have to attend every one, but there's a minimum number of sessions that they're required to attend. So there's a lot of good things you can do. And unfortunately, a lot of times, well, not a lot, but I do hear security professionals talk about the fact that because because security awareness programs don't stop all the violations, that we might as well not do them. And that's interesting because I don't hear people talking that kind of thing about firewalls or about intrusion detection systems. If they don't get 100%, then they're not worth it. Not true. This is part of that multi-layer defense that we have to remember. We can't rely just upon technology. And every so often I see the industry starting to lean towards the shiny technology. But we have to keep that balance between working to understand why our employees are violating policy and using all the different technical, management, administrative, you name it, controls to help prevent those violations. So again, we can look to industrial safety programs, right? The traditional view of risk communication and awareness training is flawed. We have to understand the relevant beliefs of the audience. We have to talk to our employees to find out how they view security, how they view policy. There's one study I read where the employees actually thought that the security program was more robust than it actually was, so they felt that their policy violations wouldn't have any effect because the security program would protect the company. Well, that's great if the security program is actually that robust, but let's be real. A non-malicious insider can open a big hole to all kinds of malicious insiders and outsiders. So it would be hard to have a security program that would completely protect against a non-malicious insider. So that's why it's so important to understand what your employees believe. And communicators must understand why the behavior is occurring. You have to spend time to go, why are they violating that policy? Why are people using personally owned USB storage devices? Oh, it's because we don't give them any other option. But, so you have to have an understanding of your audience's constraints and supporting beliefs. And that Stewart and Lacey article is a really good to tie in awareness programs and industrial safety programs. Culture change goal. Employees need to feel that they are responsible for the organization's security. Many, many years ago, I had a sit down with the head of Microsoft's information security, their CISO, and they were firm believers in having the employees be part of their security organization. They had a program at the time, I don't know if they still do, but they had a program at the time where if they had a red team that was attempting to, penetrate their network, and if an employee noticed something and reported it, and it turns out that what they noticed was the red team, they got a geek award, right? They got a T-shirt that says, "I caught the red team red-handed," and a small bonus and their name in the company newspaper. And it was a very successful program. So employees, bring them into the fold, make them part of your security program. They need to understand that the policies aren't there just because, hey, we thought, industry says it's a good idea, so that's our policy. It's because, hopefully the organization did a risk assessment, and that's what they're basing their policies on. And they need to understand the risks that they bring to the company of violating policy. Companies have gone under, right? There is a risk that you can lose your job because your company has lost so much business. And give them widely advertised channels for them to ask questions about policy and give feedback on them. Security needs to become a part of how everyone sees their workday, right? if you have an employee walking down a hallway and they see a fire door propped open, do they keep walking or do they stop and ask a question? That's the kind of thing we need to have. We need to have people stop and ask a question. That's moving security from the back of their brain to the front of their brain. And we need to educate our security engineers. We can't just put this on our non-security employees, right? Human factors when designing security programs. At the time that this study was done in 2014, human factors weren't part of many of the advanced information security degree programs, the masters and doctorates. 62% of the NSA COE institutions at the time didn't require or even offer human factors courses. And human factors is all about, what you're doing with your program. If you require, so single sign-on is a great human factors issue, right? If I require my employees to remember 10 different passwords, trust me, they're going to write them down. If I can bring a single sign-on solution into place where they only have to remember one password, it greatly reduces the probability that they're going to write those passwords down. So, and prioritize the end user experience, right? We fall into the habit of only prioritizing security, right? And, having this great, robust security program with great, robust security policy and never thinking about how your non-security, non-IT users are going to interface with it is a recipe for disaster. So think about the end user trying to follow policy in their daily work rhythm. Help them figure out how to get things done while staying compliant, right? And there's my personal thumb drive example. So we can't develop and implement our security programs in isolation from our users. Well, we obviously can because I've seen it happen a lot, but it is not a recipe for success. What about punishment? So almost every policy, user acceptance policy or general use policy, all of them have something like users knowingly violating policy may be subject to sanctions up to and including termination. So why is that there? Does it really make a difference? Well, if you look at general deterrence theory, there's three factors, but the two factors that are most often cited are the certainty of detection and the certainty of punishment if you are detected. So looking at certainty of detection, most non-malicious security violations go undetected by anyone that would take action, right? So you're in a group, you're in that meeting where you're doing, strategic business or solutioning or something, and everybody in the meeting sees the guy taking pictures of whiteboards. Nobody reports it, or nobody even says to him, hey, you probably shouldn't be doing that, right? So everybody in that room should know that that's a policy violation and why. It's not a good idea. But at the minimum, someone should say, hey, he did that, right? Nobody's going to detect it. Tailgating through doors. A lot of these things go undetected. So that puts a hole in deterrence being effective. Certainty of punishment. Do employees ever hear of someone being disciplined for policy violations? I've worked for my company for 20 years. I have never heard of anyone being disciplined for a security policy violation. Doesn't mean it hasn't happened, but because of HR rules, they usually can't advertise the fact that someone got punished. When I was in the Navy, you heard all the time of people getting punished for violations of policy, but that's a whole different story. In corporate America, it's very rare. So punishment, sanctions, general deterrence theory doesn't really help in the corporate world. So that wraps up my talk, but I do have references in the slide deck, and this will all be available afterwards. These are references for government research on insider threat and how to have insider threat programs. Here's the citation for some of the papers I cited in the presentation. The first one by Guo, Wan, Archer, and Connolly, that's the one that got me started talking about non-malicious security violations and why they need to be looked at differently. And we're getting some traction in the industry, but still, people still categorize the non-malicious in with the unintentional or the negligent. And that Meritalk, the cybersecurity experience, is a really interesting survey done with government employees, actually, federal government employees, about their views of security programs. And then there's a few more references. And then this is me. This is my contact information. I think we have time for a few questions. Happy to engage in discussion. I have a LinkedIn account, and I'm also a member of the NCSA LinkedIn group. So if you want to continue discussions there, I'm happy to. And we have 15 minutes for questions if anyone has one. And I can't see chat, so Gus, if you can help me with that.
Sure. Any questions from the audience? Well, we don't have any questions.
Okay.
So I'd like to thank Carl for his presentation today. And this will conclude our monthly webinar series. Have a great day, everyone.